Tidal cultures in the Severn Estuary. An introduction. First, some local tidal attractions. Clevedon Tidal Pool and Clevedon Pier. This is a tidal pool being filled at high tide. Here is the pier at low tide. Further down the coast there is a classic seaside resort of Weston-super-Mare, famous for its pier, low tide. Further up the coast there is Severn Beach, which used to be a seaside resort, easily reachable by train from Bristol. I have done many art collaborations there with other scholars and artists. Just up from Severn Beach is the fabulous Severn Bridge, first Severn Bridge, opened in 1966. Low tide, salt marshes. Further up the coast is Sharpness Docks, still an industrial landscape. Slimbridge, the birthplace of modern nature conservation, the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. The famous Severn Bore, which washes up the river at high tide, making a tidal wave. Just a reminder that the tides are created by the gravitational pull of the moon in various combination with the pull of the sun and other forces. Tides are scientifically well understood but also highly complex in variation and in rhythm. Rachel Carson famously said that all the sea feels the pull of the tide. It is at the coast where it has its most impact. This is Avonmouth, where the tides are the second highest in the world. There is a daily rhythm, the tide rising roughly twice each day, a monthly rhythm and a yearly rhythm. At the highest tides at Avonmouth, the sea will rise and fall as much as 14 metres in the space of about 12 hours. The highest tides in the world are at the Bay of Fundy in Canada. The height of the tides in the Severn Estuary are indicated by this picture. High tide will go right to the top of the quay. This is the Severn Bridge at low tide and high tide, photographed by Michael Martin. About 18% of the estuary is intertidal. It is very much a landscape of mud. Clearing mud off the slipway at Shirehampton Yacht Club to get into the Avon. Here are a few views. Burnham-on-Sea at low tide. Bream Beach on the lower estuary. Mid-estuary, the new Severn Bridge. Looking across the mouth of the River Wye. Burnham-on-Sea again, South Wales in the distance. At Severn Beach, anglers going out to dig for bait at low tide. Upper estuary at Arlingham, where the landscape is more riverine. It is possible to walk out on the riverbed at low tide, but care, of course, must be taken. This is Fretton. Again, you can walk out onto the rocky platforms at low tide. Due to the tides, the mud, the currents, it is a dangerous landscape. There have been many disasters on the Severn. The landscape is haunted by memorials and past tragedies. People can be caught out and drowned by the incoming tide. Much of the estuary's coast is lined with sea walls. These are concrete, highly engineered in many places. In other places they are earthen banks which snake along the shore. These protect the very distinctive coastal levels from flooding at high tide. There is a history and material culture of reens, sluices and drainage outfalls. The Somerset levels are a very distinctive wetland landscape. They would have been much more tidal before the seawalls and the engineering. The landscape is used for recreation, like walking, for sailing and canoeing and kayaking, for fishing. It is a landscape of resource extraction, for example, sand dredging. Sewage discharge. Nuclear power generation. The power stations use huge volumes of water, and there is great concern over their impacts on fish stock. They have technologies to cope with the rise and fall of the tides. Coastal agriculture. Major transport infrastructure. Amongst this landscape of economic development, there is significant heritage of wildlife. The estuary falls under many nature conservation designations: Ramsar sites, SPAs, SSSIs and local nature reserves. This is for bird life, and for fish ecology. It is possible on occasions to see seals swimming in high tide. This is at Sharpness. The seal seems to be playing in the flow of the incoming tide. Eels are a key species of the estuary and its rivers. This one was seen when they were draining Clevedon Tidal Pool to refresh the water. This happens a number of times a year and is watched by local citizens, and volunteers go to save the fish that are washed out of the pool and across the beach as the water washes down to the sea. They're saving the fish from being attacked by the gulls that have learnt to come when the pool is being drained. The estuary poses many environmental challenges, and there's a complex mix of agencies to deal with it. Flooding is a risk around the estuary and is linked to the rhythm of the tides. At the highest tides around the estuary, numerous tide gates have to be shut by the Environment Agency to keep out high water. In 1607 there was a devastating flood on the Welsh and English levels. The height of the flood was marked on the church walls around the estuary. Thousands of people were drowned. Now books are used in local schools to tell the story. Recently published flood prediction maps show the vulnerability of the estuary lowlands to climate change sea level rise. There are serious concerns about the fate of the estuary's nuclear power stations. There is a history of ferries across the estuary. The Old Passage ferry ran from Ouse to Beachley and was in service until the Severn Bridge opened in 1966. People's relationship with the landscape and the water and the tides was radically changed by the opening of the bridge. Catching the ferry often involved a wait until the tide was suitable for passage. The Severn Railway Tunnel also replaced ferry services across the estuary. From the 19th century to 1960 there was a railway bridge across the estuary at Sharpness, but this was lost in a disaster, hit by a tanker at high tide in fog. It was never rebuilt. Communities on either side were separated. This medieval map shows all the smaller waterways flowing into the estuary. These were often small harbours. There were local harbours all along the shore of the Welsh and English coast. This is Lidney Harbour, which is now in receipt of large amounts of lottery heritage funding for heritage restoration. Chepstow at the mouth of the River Wye was a significant local port, trading a lot with Bristol. A small harbour at Littleton-on-Severn supplied Bristol with bricks. Due to the challenges of the tidal waters of the estuary, famous boat designs evolved. The Severn Trow, a cargo ship, and the Bristol Pilot Cutter, a fast sailing ship. The wrecks of many of the estuary's ships ended up at Purton Ship Graveyard on the south bank near Sharpness. Many of the smaller inlets or pills are now engineered for flooding and drainage purposes. Bristol would have been a marshy and tidal landscape with 100 miles of waterway. It was a tidal port until the 19th century, with ships right in the middle of the city. But the port facilities moved further downstream to the mouth of the Avonmouth as ships got bigger. A city not just built upon the water, but upon the tides too. Throughout the estuary there was various forms of tidal fishing, stopping boats with using small nets at certain points of the tide. Putchers were willow traps mostly for salmon, which were accessed each low tide. Lathe nets were large handheld nets used by wading in the incoming tide. This is now only a heritage activity. Eels and baby eels, elvers, were a huge part of the fishing industry of the estuary, and there was a considerable amount of black market activity all along the upper estuary. At high tide, in the height of the years of the elvers, the river was said to look silver in the moonlight. A key point is that all these activities, economies, cultures, ecologies, have a temporality dictated as much by the tides as by day and night. This is a time-lapse film with the tide coming in at Sharpness docks over the space of a few hours. Just shot on an iPhone. I made a chair out of found washed up items. All along the estuary, activities have to be coordinated with the time of the tides. The water is always on the move. Often there are incredible patterns and rhythms in the water as the tides rise and fall, and the water is heavy with silt. This is brown water, not blue water. This is filmed off Clevedon Pier, and it is an ebbing tide, that is the tide falling after the high tide an hour or so ago. The water is flowing west out of the estuary. Understanding tide times and heights has been vital throughout history, so tide clocks and tide machines have been developed as science has advanced. This is my Bristol Tide Table Book 2021. It tells me the height and time of each high tide at various points along the estuary. Sharpness Docks, 8th of April. My 2011 paper on lunar solar rhythm patterns and material cultures of tides discusses this. With Michaela Palmer of University West of England and also with some students, we created some sonifications of various tidal rhythms of the estuary. This was discussed in our paper of 2014. Here is a film of high tide at Sharpness Docks, where various mobilities come together, that of large-scale shipping and also migrating birds flying upstream. And large pieces of driftwood might set sail on the highest tide again. At low tide in the estuary you would see nothing but sand. This is Berkeley Nuclear Power Station, the first in the world to produce domestic energy. There is an excitement and an atmosphere at the very highest tides. These large cargo ships can only set sail on the very highest tides. The same goes for the Royal Portbury docks and other docks around the estuary, but most of the docks have now faded into disuse, including those at Cardiff and Newport and Barry and at least the centre of Bristol. This is more or less the same view at low tide. The tide brings all manner of things. Huge bits of driftwood, famously a whale washed up at Littleton-on Severn. People harvest driftwood for firewood. There is, of course, a huge amount of plastic pollution all along the estuary. Every now and again you get beach cleanup operations underway, and some strange finds. I still have this doll. Now we turn to artistic responses to and engagements with this landscape. This is the work of the painter Andrew Hardwick, who is also a farmer, who farms on the coastal levels. The artist Alison Nabor is doing a project on climate change in the estuary, walking what she thinks will be the future coast path. The University Arts and Humanities Research Project worked with the artist Tanner West about power and the estuary, and she makes beautiful artefacts out of the mud gained from different parts of the estuary. It has different colours due to the different minerals in the mud. She also made beautiful prints using microscopic images of organisms and structures found in the estuary mud. The famous war photographer Don McCullin, who lives in Somerset, has taken a series of photographs of the estuary landscape as well as the Somerset levels. These show the dramatic light and space you can get on the estuary at both high and low tide. The artist Carolyn Black lives in the small town of Newnham on the banks of the river and has made a series of beautiful drawings and a series of videos of the Severn Boar, exploring her relationship with the place. The artist and scholar Davina Kirkpatrick created a series of artworks set in the intertidal area which explored grief and bereavement and materiality and the agency of the tides. The artist Louisa Fairclough also used the estuary as a landscape for exploring grief and loss. She cycled extensively around the estuary, camped on its banks, often with a young son with her. She did a series of drawings and made a series of art installations that were exhibited both in Bristol and in London. An account of this is in our 2016 paper, Sounding Grief. The Bristol-based artist Lucy Gorrell-Barnes did artworks relating to the refugee crisis using the high tides and paper models of lost houses and lost people on the high tides. Art groups such as Walking the Land have done collective exhibitions in spaces along the estuary. There is a significant legacy of poetry related to the Severn Estuary and its tides. Alice Oswald's A Sleep Walk on the Severn, written for the Severn Festival 2009. Welsh poet laureate Gillian Clark's collection A Recipe for Water, a poem specifically about the tide. Philip Gross's collection The Water Table, which won the T.S. Eliot Prize for Poetry. The Severn was brown and the Severn was blue, not this then that, not either or, no mixture. Two things can be true. The hills were clouds and the mist a shore. The Severn was water, the water was mud, whose eddies stood and did not fill, the kind of water that's thicker than blood. The river was flowing, the flowing was still. The tide ripped the sound of dry fluttering wings. with waves that did not break or fall. We were two of the world's small particular things. We were old, we were young, we were no age at all. For a moment not doing, nor coming undone, words gained, words lost, till who's to say which was the father, which was the son, a week or 50 years away. But the water said earth, and the water said sky. We were everyone we'd been or would be, every angle of light that says you, that says I, and the sea was the river, and the river the sea. The title of my 2015 Arts and Humanities paper, Not Promising a Landfall, was taken from one of Gross's poems. This paper is very much about memories of the estuary and of the tides and of its bridges and of journeys to and fro and in between. Gross's poems make reference to the islands of the estuary. Steepholm, Flatholm. It is possible to visit Flatholm. It is a strange landscape. Your visit is determined by high tide and low tide. It is a landscape of military remains. There is a very small island by the first Severn Bridge called Black Rock or Chapel Rock. You can walk there at low tide and you find that somebody has made a shrine there. Various initiatives have tried to reconnect Bristol with its tidal history and its river history. Mouth of the Avon in about 1980. Sea fishing at high tide at Shirehampton. The highest tides in Bristol are still an event which people stop to watch or even come to film and photograph. A sculpture by the artist Anthony Lyons marks the very highest point of the tide. This is a few hours later. Lefebvre, in Rhythm Analysis, talks about moon cities and solar cities. Bristol is a moon city. This is one of the old ferry crossings. There are still wild tidal areas near the city centre. Further afield, people will go out high tide watching. This is at Severn Beach. This is a view a few hours later. From 2015 to 2018, a series of events were held as part of Bristol Green Capital and a large Arts and Humanities Research Council grant. This included working with the street theatre company The Desperate Men and a number of artists and academics from Bristol and the University of West of England. The lead creative partner was Nova Arts, and also we worked with My Future, My Choice, a youth careers group. We worked in schools and did performances centred around two characters invented to represent the tides. Some of this recounted in this book chapter on narrative affect and threatened ecologies of tides.
Good people of Bristol and the Green Scrappital, gathered here today at the Grand Syzygy, and you're here in this unique concatenation of the waters and amongst these lovely people to take an oath in sight of the assembled crowd and to swear your allegiance to the tides and all that sail upon them. Hold up your right hand. Say aye. Aye. Say aye aye. Aye. Say aye aye, Captain. Aye. Say aye 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 aye. Like you very much. Aye aye aye. No. I'm stupid.
You started it.
I hereby do solemnly swear upon the tidal reaches of the Avon and the Bristol Channel upon the Bay of Fundy where's that? What's the other? In the name of the sun and the moon. Upon the eels, the salmon and the lamprey. Upon the cockles and mussels, alive, oh. In sight of the reeds of the red shank. Upon the oyster of the world. To hereby. Ever to. Always. In eternity. In constancy. Forever. Till the tides do us part. Two. Visit the river. Witness the boar. Paddle in the seas. Search in the tidal pools. Drink from the springs. To take to the pill at the Shire Hampton. To gorge upon the suspension of particulates. To love the Avon and all her tributaries. To never frown upon the froom. To take the new cut seriously. And wait a minute, I've messed up my pages.
Wait a minute, I've messed up my pages. Don't have to repeat that.
Two. Reimagine the nature of citizenship. And community from ecological perspectives. That's a direct quote. To recognise the flow of water through everything. To embrace the fluidity of all things. Wait till I finish. Don't repeat everything I say. To embrace the fluidity of all things. To love my loo. Not just mine, yours as well. With only the three P's. Paper, pee and poo. And furthermore, to never, ever, never to, again, drink water from a plastic bottle.
It's from a tap. I just filled it up.
To be green. With envy. Whenever I see someone on a bicycle. To understand marine energy and ecology. To lock into my heritage and my future. To embrace hydropoetics. Art and music. Till the day I die. Not long now. To love the water cycle. And the bicycle. To champion biodiversity. And be part of Water City. Nearly finished. To be a hydro citizen for the 21st century. And to learn to love my tide. Amen. Mermen. Barmen. So help me squid. Thank you very much.
We curated an arts event for Frank, Friends of Avon New Cut, using lottery heritage funded money, a day of activities to celebrate the tides in the New Cut and to raise public awareness of the ecology, the history and the issues. This included music, street art, and printing demonstrations by the Small Works Print Company. We staged a one-day tidal festival at the fabulous Lamplighters Marsh, where there is a green space and a pub, and this was done at highest tide of the year with a number of collaborators, again celebrating mud and ecology and tidal rhythms, working with the local community group and Shirehampton Parish Council and My Future, My Choice. This included setting paper boats a sail on the high tide. As part of the Arts and Humanities Being Human Festival, we staged a night of watery music and film performance about tides and rivers in All Hallows Hall, including performances by the Fantasy Orchestra. Working with animators from Aardman Animation and schools and a number of artists, we made a film about eel conservation and eel ecology. This was in partnership with the Sustainable Eel Group and involved events at the Fishmongers Hall, London, and also events in Keynsham at the Bristol Festival of Nature. All this activity was to raise awareness of tidal cultures and tidal ecology and history in the city of Bristol and the surrounding areas. Some of this work has been written up in papers and book chapters, including the chapter I wrote with the artists Anthony Lyons and Lucy Gorrell Barnes. Turner Prize-winning artists Richard Long and Simon Starling have done work on the Avon Tides and Bristol Mud, commissioned by Spike Island Gallery. Now we come to issues of losses of tidal places. This is a Lambie, an intertidal grasslands areas by Cardiff, by the mouth of the River Rumney. It was a tidal salt marsh used for grazing stock in the summer, covered only by the high tides. In the late 1970s, it was acquired by Cardiff City Council for a refuse site, and the tides excluded. This is written about in my paper of 2005. On the other side of Cardiff there was a Taff Estuary, also a wild tidal place. A place of mud, of shifting tides, of boats and fishing and ecology. But this was the 1980s, where urban development corporations could override planning procedures, and a barrage was proposed. Not a barrage to create power, but just to create high water, to exclude the tides. This was vehemently opposed by many environmental organisations, but the barrage was built. The tide is now excluded from the bay, and the water is of a different colour to the rest of the estuary, as seen on Google Earth. The rivers don't flow properly anymore. There has been great interest in putting a larger barrage across the whole Severn Estuary for creating tidal power. This idea has been around since Victorian times. This has attracted great concern from environmental and nature conservation agencies concerned about fish stocks, concerned about bird life, and also concerned about cultures such as surfing on the Severn Bore. One of Gillian Clarke's short poems is about the threat of a barrage to the bird life. Plans for a large barrage were dropped some years ago, but new plans for a smaller barrage and tidal lagoons are still in the air. Nature conservation bodies favour smarter tidal energy that does not involve large concrete dams. At Steart Marshes by the mouth of the River Parrett, new tidal wetlands have been made by opening up the sea wall. From 2012 to 2014, I was involved in a project which twinned the Severn Estuary with the Dutch Wadden Sea, which is another tidal landscape and is a World Heritage Site. Workshops were held in both locations with artists and scholars, and we all took part in a Sense of Place conference held by the Wadden Sea Academy. My research partner was Dr. Bettina van Hoven from Groningen University. Since 2013, I've been running the Tidal Cultures blog. This has a lot of information on it, including a glossary of poetic tidal terms, a long list of tide-related artworks from around the world, and a list of non-fiction book on tides, as well as many other things. From the blog has sprung my current collaboration with artist and Professor Heather Green from Arizona State University. Heather does research and a range of artistic practices in a bay called Bahia Adair in Mexico, in the north of the Bay of California. This is a huge tidal area. It makes casts of various marks found in the intertidal area, including the patterns made in the sand by the water and the patterns made by the movement of creatures of various kinds, and even the marks made by humans. It also makes art books which list all the ecological and cultural terms of these places and uses organic material to make handmade paper. This is a form of deep mapping of this amazing tidal place. This is a film from her website where twinned pictures stream. This is very much about the patterns and the marks and the changing patterns and changing marks and changing vistas. These are amazing places. I have been photographing marks in the mud of the Severn Estuary, ecological marks and human marks, with a view to Heather coming back in the near future to make casts of such things. An account of this is forthcoming in a new paper to be published in Rivers Research Journal.